The Blood Rite was meant to be the final seal. Inside the vast expanse of the Lycan Kingdom's throne hall, 400 nobles stood in absolute silence. Golden light from the massive chandeliers poured over the black marble floor, reflecting the cold, ancient power of the royal court. At the center of the dais stood Lycan King Valerius. For 400 years, he had ruled with a quiet, overwhelming authority. His dark alpha aura pressed against the room, heavy and unavoidable, demanding submission without him ever having to speak a word. Tonight, he was meant to bind his soul to the woman standing beside him. Ellaraine wore a gown of ivory and silver, a false crown resting perfectly on her dark hair. She looked every inch the Luna the kingdom expected. Yet, her fingers trembled slightly as she watched the crystal goblet being offered to the king. The goblet contained the sacred blood wine. One drink, and the mate bond would be recognized by pack law forever. Valerius reached out. His expression was chiseled in cold stone, his amber eyes completely unreadable. He did not feel the fiery pull of a true mate when he looked at Ellaraine. He only felt the heavy weight of duty. He lifted the crystal rim toward his lips. By the servants' wall, hidden in the deep shadows of the hall, Seraphina held her breath. She was a mere Omega maid, dressed in a faded gray uniform, completely invisible to the high lords and ladies. Her only anchor to the world was the small hand gripping her skirt. Her 5-year-old daughter Nerissa was not supposed to be here. But Seraphina had nowhere else to leave her tonight. "Quiet, little one," Seraphina whispered, her heart aching as she watched the king she secretly served prepare to bind himself to another. But Nerissa was not looking at the king. Her wide, pale eyes were fixed entirely on the crystal goblet. Where the nobles saw rich, dark wine, the 5-year-old girl saw something else. A thick, suffocating black smoke was coiling upward from the liquid, twisting like venomous snakes. The dark magic was blindingly obvious to the child's ancient bloodline, screaming of corruption and death. The crystal rim touched Valerius's lips. "Don't drink it." The scream tore through the throne hall like a shattered glass. It was not a cry of fear. It was a desperate, piercing command from a 5-year-old child. 400 nobles froze. The heavy silence of the Blood Rite shattered instantly. Valerius stopped, the goblet hovering just a fraction of an inch from his mouth. For 4 centuries, no living creature had dared to interrupt this Lycan king. Nerissa broke away from the wall. Small, bare feet slapped against the cold black marble, running straight into the center of the most dangerous room in the kingdom. "Nerissa! No!" Seraphina's voice cracked in pure terror. She lunged after her daughter. Her foot caught on the rough stone, and the hem of her faded gray dress tore with a loud rip. She didn't care. She scrambled forward, her pulse deafening in her ears. Ellaraine's composed face twisted into sudden, raw panic. The false Luna stared at the child, pointing directly at the poisoned goblet. "Treason!" Ellaraine shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate, breaking the royal decorum. "How dare this filthy Omega child curse the sacred rite? Guards, cut her down! Kill her!" The royal guards, conditioned to obey the Luna's commands, drew their heavy silver blades. The sound of metal leaving scabbards rang brutally in the open hall. 2 guards lunged toward the tiny 5-year-old girl. Seraphina did not scream for mercy. She did not fall to her knees to beg the king. Moving faster than a mere Omega ever should, she threw herself across the black marble. She tackled her daughter to the ground just as the guards closed in. Seraphina curled her fragile body entirely over Nerissa, burying the child's face in her chest. In the violent motion, the torn collar of her dress slipped. A cracked, ancient moonstone pendant tumbled out from against her collarbone, resting starkly against the dark floor. Seraphina squeezed her eyes shut, gritting her teeth. She held her warm dignity, refusing to cry out, waiting for the heavy silver blade to slice through her back. The executioner's sword swung down. The executioner's blade was inches from Seraphina's spine. "Halt!" The word was not shouted. It was spoken with a terrifyingly quiet, lethal calm. Yet, the command carried the full, crushing weight of a 400-year-old Alpha King. A heavy, suffocating pressure slammed into the throne hall. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down on the lungs of every noble present. The two guards, swinging their swords, froze instantly. Their muscles locked, their bodies instinctively submitting to the absolute dominance of their Lycan King. The heavy silver blade halted a mere breath away from Seraphina's torn gray dress. Valerius had not moved from the dais. His hand still held the crystal goblet, but deep within his chest, a low, primal vibration was tearing through his ribs. His inner wolf, the ancient, scarred black Lycan that had survived centuries of war, was snarling, not at the child who interrupted the rite, but at the guards who dared to raise a weapon against the fragile woman on the floor. He did not understand the instinct. He only knew that the thought of her blood spilling in his hall made his fangs ache to tear something apart. Beneath the frozen blade, Seraphina slowly opened her eyes. She did not whimper. She did not grovel or cry out for mercy like a common servant caught in a royal transgression. She kept her body firmly wrapped around her 5-year-old daughter, Sasai, her protective posture unbroken. Slowly she lifted her chin, her stormy gray eyes meeting the cold gaze of the Lycan King. The cracked moonstone pendant resting against her collarbone caught the chandelier's light. For a fraction of a second, Valerius's gaze snagged on the dull, ancient stone. A strange pulse of heat flared at the base of his skull, an echo of a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "Your Majesty!" Elaren gasped, her voice trembling as she tried to salvage the moment. She stepped closer to the throne, her ivory gown sweeping the floor. "This Omega has ruined the Blood Rite. She and her cursed spawn must be punished by pack law immediately." Valerius did not look at his bride. His amber eyes remained locked on the tiny girl shielded beneath her mother's arms. "Don't drink it." The child's scream echoed in his mind. For centuries, assassins had tried to take his life using steel, magic, and seduction. None had ever used a child to deliver a warning. Moving with deliberate, terrifying slowness, Valerius lowered his hand. He looked at the crystal goblet. The dark wine shimmered beautifully under the gold light. It smelled of rich blood and aged spices. Perfect. Too perfect. "You claim she ruined the rite," Valerius said, his voice a low rumble that carried to every corner of the vast hall. "Let us see what the child interrupted." Without breaking eye contact with Elaren, Valerius tilted his wrist. He tipped the crystal goblet over the edge of the dais. The dark red liquid cascaded onto the black marble floor. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of liquid hitting stone. Then, the hissing began. A violent acidic sizzle erupted from the marble. The dark wine bubbled aggressively, turning pitch black as it ate aggressively into the ancient stone floor. Thick, foul-smelling smoke coiled upward, matching exactly what the 5-year-old girl had seen moments before. A collective gasp rippled through the 400 nobles. Several high lords stepped back in sheer horror. "Blood-Bane," an elder whispered, his voice trembling with terror. It was a forbidden poison, designed not to stop the heart, but to sever a Lycan's soul from its wolf. If Valerius had swallowed even a drop, his 400 years of immortality would not have saved him. He would have died choking on his own blood right on the throne. Elaren's face lost all color. The polished, regal mask of the false Luna cracked, leaving behind the pale, terrified expression of a woman who knew her execution had just arrived. Seraphina remained perfectly still on the floor, holding Nerissa close, her gray eyes watching the toxic smoke rise. The child had told the truth. Her daughter's Werewolf blood had seen the corruption. Valerius stared at the ruined, smoking marble. The calmness that had defined his centuries of rule vanished. When he finally looked up, his amber eyes were gone. In their place burned the pure, predatory gold of a completely enraged alpha. "Seal the heavy iron doors," Valerius commanded, his voice shaking the grand chandeliers above. "No one leaves this hall. If anyone steps toward the exit, take their head." The heavy iron doors of the great hall slammed shut. The resounding crash echoed like a death knell. Heavy iron bolts slid into place, trapping 400 of the most powerful Lycan nobles inside. Panic rippled through the crowd, replacing the dignified silence with terrified whispers. They were locked in a room with a poisoned king whose wolf was now fully awake and enraged. Valerius did not look at the frantic crowd. He slowly descended the black marble steps of the dais. With every step he took, the nobles scrambled backward, parting like a frightened sea. His golden eyes were fixed entirely on the small figures still huddled on the floor. Seraphina tensed as the massive Lycan King approached. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. She tightened her arms around Nerissa, shielding the child's small body with her own. Her torn gray uniform, stained with the dust of the floor, marked her as the lowest of the low in this grand room. But her stormy gray eyes did not drop in submission. She watched his heavy black boots stop just inches from her knees. The royal guards, expecting the king to issue an execution order, stood at attention. Instead, Valerius did something that made the entire court stop breathing. The 400-year-old Lycan King, the ancient ruler of Verith, lowered his massive frame and dropped to one knee. He brought himself down to the eye level of the 5-year-old girl. His dark velvet cloak pooled around him on the black marble, touching the frayed hem of Seraphina's dress. It was an unprecedented act of humility. A ruler did not kneel, but Valerius was not speaking to his court right now. He was speaking to the one person in the room who had dared to save his life. "You are not in trouble," Valerius said. The lethal, shaking boom of his alpha command was entirely gone, replaced by a low, steady rumble meant to soothe. "Nobody in this hall is going to hurt you. Do you understand?" Nerissa peeked out from her mother's protective grip. She looked into the terrifying, glowing gold eyes of the Alpha King and slowly nodded. "Tell me what you saw," Valerius asked quietly, ignoring the gasps of the nobles behind him. "Take your time." Nerissa did not hesitate. She gently untangled her small hand from her mother's torn sleeve. She raised one tiny finger and pointed it directly at the dais. "The lady," Nerissa said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. She put the black smoke in the cup. It twisted like bad worms. Elloren let out a choked, indignant gasp. "Lies! The child is a filthy liar! I would never—" Valerius did not even turn his head. He simply raised one hand, silencing the false Luna instantly. The heavy alpha pressure he emitted warned her that one more word would cost her her tongue. He looked back at Nerissa. "Just the lady?" Nerissa shook her head. Her small finger shifted, pointing past Elloren, aiming directly at a tall, elegant man standing in the shadows behind the throne. The tall man gave it to her, Nerissa stated firmly. "He smells like dead things." A fresh wave of shock hit the room. She was pointing at Lord Cadron, the king's most trusted royal advisor. Cadron's expression did not crack. The elegant, seasoned politician stepped forward out of the shadows, his face an immaculate mask of composed sympathy. He walked toward the king, projecting the calm aura of a man wrongfully accused by an ignorant child. "Your Majesty," Cadron said, bowing his head respectfully. "I understand the tension of this moment. A vile attempt has been made on your life, but surely we are not taking the word of a frightened, low-born Omega child. Children see monsters in the shadows, especially those who do not belong in a royal court." Cadron's dark eyes shifted downward, locking onto Seraphina. His gaze was cold, filled with a subtle, venomous threat. "It is far more likely," Cadron continued, his voice smooth and carrying across the hall, "that the mother trained the girl to disrupt the rite, an Omega seeking to gain favor, or perhaps a pathetic act of treason orchestrated by your enemies. This maid and her child should be taken to the dungeons immediately for aggressive questioning before they can spread more confusion." Seraphina's jaw tightened. The threat was clear. If Cadron took them to the dungeons, they would never see the light of day again. Cadron's dark eyes promised death. To the rest of the court, he looked like a concerned advisor trying to protect his king from a desperate, treasonous maid. But Seraphina knew exactly what that look meant. If Valerius handed them over, they would be slaughtered in the dark. She is not lying. Seraphina's voice was not a shout, but it held a strange, resonant clarity that cut cleanly through the anxious murmurs of the 400 nobles. She did not lower her head. She looked past Cadron's polished boots, lifting her gaze to meet the glowing golden eyes of Lycan King Valerius. "My daughter does not invent monsters in the shadows," Seraphina said. her voice steadying as she tightened her grip on Nerissa. She sees the truth that others cannot. The blood of the Werewolf does not lie. A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the older nobles in the hall. The Werewolf. It was an ancient, nearly forgotten bloodline. A myth from the early days of Wereth. The Werewolves were the silent guardians of the true crown, born with the innate ability to sense dark magic, deception, and poison. They were not warriors, but truth-seers. Kadron let out a cold, dismissive scoff. A ragged Omega Maid claiming the blood of ancient legends? This is pure madness, Your Majesty. She is clearly unhinged and grasping for any lie to save her neck. Seraphina's heart pounded furiously against her ribs. The sheer stress of the moment, the terrifying pressure of standing against the highest powers of the kingdom to protect her child, pushed her physical and emotional limits to the breaking point. Deep within her, something fractured. It was an invisible seal, a dark court magic that had been placed on her 5 years ago to suppress her true nature and keep her hidden in the shadows as a lowly Omega. Now, under the intense weight of a mother's fierce love, the seal cracked. A scent slipped into the air. It was faint at first, barely a whisper over the smell of the acidic, burning poison on the marble. But to the heightened senses of a Lycan King, it was like a sudden, violent crack of thunder. Frost pine, crisp, biting, and impossibly pure. Valerius froze. The golden glow in his eyes flared dangerously bright. His inner black Lycan, which had been restless and roaring just moments ago, suddenly went completely still, captivated by the scent it had searched for over 4 centuries. He inhaled slowly, his broad chest expanding. The scent was coming directly from the woman kneeling before him in the torn, dirty gray dress. Mate. The bond pulled at his ribs, a physical ache that stole his breath. Valerius looked down at Seraphina, truly looking at her for the first time. He saw the quiet dignity in her stormy gray eyes, the fierce protection in her fragile frame. Then, he looked up at Elaraine. For 3 years, he had believed Elaraine was his destined Luna because of a supposed prophecy and a carefully masked scent. But now, with the crisp aroma of frost pine filling his senses, Elaraine suddenly smelled entirely wrong. She smelled of heavy perfumes, bitter herbs, and forced magic. The realization hit the king with a cold, devastating clarity. He had been manipulated. Before Valerius could act on the staggering truth of the mate bond, an old man stepped cautiously out of the crowd. It was the royal physician. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion," the elderly Lycan said, kneeling a safe distance from the bubbling puddle of black poison. "But I must examine the marble." Valerius did not take his eyes off Seraphina, his body instinctively angling to shield her from the rest of the room. "Speak, physician." The old man waved his hand over the smoking stone, his face going pale. "This is Blood-Bane, indeed, but not the common variety brewed in back alleys. Look at the concentration, how deeply it eats the ancient stone." The physician looked up, his voice trembling. "This is royal grade. It has been perfectly preserved." "Meaning?" Valerius demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Meaning, Your Majesty, this poison did not come from outside the castle walls," the physician stated, standing up and addressing the quiet hall. "It came from the deepest, most secure vault in the royal treasury, a vault that can only be opened by the master key." The absolute silence in the throne hall was deafening. Every single pair of eyes in the room slowly turned away from the maid on the floor, shifting to look at the man standing confidently near the dais. Lord Kadron, the king's advisor, and the sole keeper of the royal treasury keys. The weight of 400 pairs of eyes shifted, pinning Lord Kadron to the spot. For the first time all evening, Kadron's immaculate composure faltered. A single bead of sweat formed at his temple. His hand instinctively twitched toward the heavy iron ring of keys secured at his leather belt. It was a micro-expression of guilt, a fleeting loss of control. But to a 400-year-old Lycan King, it was a full confession. Valerius rose slowly to his full height. He did not roar. He did not draw a weapon. His voice was a weapon of its own, forged in centuries of absolute rule. "Captain of the guard," Valerius commanded, his glowing golden eyes burning into his advisor. "Search him. Strip him of his keys and whatever else he hides." "Your Majesty, this is an outrage," Cadron protested, taking a step back as 4 elite guards immediately closed in on him. "I have served this throne for a decade. You would humiliate me based on the babbling of an old physician and a delusional Omega?" "Hold him," Valerius ordered softly. The guards seized Cadron, forcing him to his knees despite his struggles. The captain of the guard swiftly unhooked the master keys from the advisor's belt, but he did not stop there. Running his hands expertly over Cadron's elegant velvet coat, the captain felt a rigid square hidden within the inner lining. He ripped the seam open and pulled out a folded parchment, sealed with dark wax. The captain bowed and handed the parchment to the king. Valerius broke the seal. The throne hall was so silent that the tearing of the wax echoed against the high walls. As Valerius read the elegant handwriting on the parchment, his expression hardened into a mask of pure, glacial fury. The scent of frost pine emanating from Seraphina grounded his inner wolf, preventing him from tearing Cadron's throat out right then and there. "An interesting correspondence," Valerius finally said, his voice dropping in temperature. He looked up, his gaze sliding from Cadron to Elaren, who was now trembling uncontrollably by the dais. "It outlines a very precise timeline for tonight's Blood Rite. The poison to be administered, the forged Luna mark to be maintained by court magic, and, most tellingly, a contingency plan." Valerius stepped forward, the heavy parchment crushed in his massive fist. If the poison was discovered, Valerius read the words aloud, making sure every noble heard the depth of the betrayal. "The Omega Maid and her brat will take the fall. They are nobodies. The king will execute them blindly, leaving no loose ends for when the blood crown changes hands." Seraphina's breath hitched. She pulled Nerissa tighter against her chest, her gray eyes widening as the sheer malice of the plot washed over her. They had planned to use her daughter's life as a cheap shield for their treason. Valerius looked down at Seraphina. The realization of how close he had come to executing his true mate and an innocent child, all because of his blind trust in his inner circle, struck him like a physical blow. The guilt and accountability settled heavy in his chest. He had allowed this rot to grow in his court. "You thought me a fool," Valerius said to Cadron, dropping the parchment onto the poisoned floor. "You thought power was a game of shadows and forged documents, but you forgot that a true Lycan King does not rule by paper. He rules by truth." Elaren collapsed to her knees, sobbing violently, the false crown slipping precariously on her head. "Valerius, please! He forced me! Cadron threatened me!" "Silence," Valerius commanded, his authority crushing her words into a whimper. Cadron, seeing that his grand deception had completely unraveled, stopped struggling against the guards. A dark, ugly sneer twisted his handsome face. "You always were too sentimental for a beast, Valerius," Cadron spat, the respectful facade completely gone. "You think you have won because you found a piece of paper? I have planned this for years. If I cannot take the throne quietly, I will take it through blood." Before Valerius could issue the order to drag them to the cells, a deafening sound shattered the tension in the room. Clang, clang, clang. The deep, urgent toll of the castle's heavy iron alarm bells rang out from the outer courtyard. The heavy iron doors of the throne hall shuddered as something massive battered against them from the outside. Cadron had not come alone. His rebel forces had breached the royal castle. The heavy iron doors groaned under the violent impact from the outside. Inside the throne hall, the illusion of safety shattered. Several royal guardsmen Cadron had secretly bought over the years suddenly turned their weapons on the loyalists. The elegant Blood Rite dissolved into a chaotic battlefield of clashing silver and panicked screams. Nobles in velvet and jewels scrambled for cover behind the marble pillars as the treacherous guards moved to secure the dais for Cadron. A traitorous guard lunged toward the king, his blade aimed directly at Valerius's unprotected back. But a 400-year-old Lycan King did not survive centuries of war by being slow. Valerius spun, his fist colliding with the guard's chest with the force of a battering ram. The traitor flew backward, his armor caving in, sliding lifelessly across the poisoned black marble. Kadrin used the momentary distraction to rip himself free from the loyal guards holding him. He sprinted toward the hidden passage behind the throne, disappearing into the shadows of the royal vaults. Every instinct of the Black Lycan screamed at Valerius to hunt the traitor down. His golden eyes locked onto the dark archway where Kadron had vanished. He took one step in pursuit. Then, he heard a terrified whimper from the floor. Nerissa. Valerius stopped dead. The burning desire for vengeance instantly evaporated, overridden by a force infinitely more powerful, the primal need to protect. He abandoned the chase. Turning his broad back on the fleeing traitor, the Alpha King stepped directly in front of Seraphina and her child. 2 more rebel guards rushed them, their swords raised. Valerius didn't even draw his own weapon. He threw out his arms, catching one blade with his bare, armored forearm, and shattered the other guard's knee with a devastating kick. Moving with startling gentleness despite the violence around them, Valerius dropped to one knee again. He threw his heavy, dark velvet cloak completely over Seraphina and Nerissa, pulling them flush against his side, shielding their fragile bodies from the chaos with his massive frame. "Do not move," Valerius commanded softly, his chest rumbling against Seraphina's shoulder. The physical contact was electric. The moment Valerius's powerful, protective aura enveloped her, the cracked seal within Seraphina's blood finally, violently, shattered. It was as if a physical chain had snapped inside her chest. The stifled, silent wolf that had slept for 5 agonizing years suddenly woke with a deafening, spiritual howl. The faint scent of frostpine did not just slip into the air, this time it exploded. A wave of crisp, dominant, winter-fresh scent rolled across the dais, washing away the metallic smell of blood and the acidic stench of poison. It was the undeniable, suffocatingly pure scent of a true Luna. Beneath the frayed collar of her torn gray dress, the skin at the base of Seraphina's neck began to burn. A silver light, pure and blinding like captured moonlight, bled through the fabric. The crescent moon mark of the Werewolf bloodline announced its presence to the entire room. Several loyal guards and nobles near the dais stopped fighting for a fraction of a second. The sheer pressure of the Luna's scent, forcing their wolves to instinctively lower their heads. Valerius felt the surge of power against his side. He looked down, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of absolute awe and fierce possessiveness as the silver light illuminated Seraphina's face. She was no longer just the brave maid who had saved him. The ancient pack law was writing itself into the air between them. Not far away, crawling on the marble to escape the skirmish, Elleraine saw the silver glow. The false Luna stared at the glowing crescent mark on the maid's neck, and then smelled the overwhelming frostpine scent. The truth hit her with devastating clarity. The throne, the crown, the king, none of it had ever belonged to her. Fate had always chosen this ragged, filthy Omega. Driven completely mad by jealousy and the sudden, humiliating loss of everything she had schemed for, Elleraine snapped. She reached beneath the folds of her ivory gown and pulled out a slender, jewel-encrusted dagger, its edge dripping with the same black blood-bane used in the goblet. Valerius was distracted, heavily engaged in snapping the wrist of a rebel soldier who had tried to flank them. He was turned away for just 1 second. With a feral, unhinged shriek, Elleraine lunged across the dais, the poisoned blade aimed directly at Seraphina's glowing neck. "Die, you filthy thief!" Elleraine shrieked, driving the poisoned dagger downward. Valerius spun around, his golden eyes widening as he realized he was a fraction of a second too late to intercept the strike. But Seraphina did not cower. The woman who had thrown her fragile body over her child to take an executioner's sword was not going to freeze before a desperate, ousted liar. The shattered seal had not just released her scent and the glowing crescent mark on her neck. It had unleashed the ancient, undeniable authority of the Werewolf bloodline. As the poisoned blade descended, Seraphina did not reach for a weapon. She stood up, placing herself firmly in front of Nerissa, and released the full, crushing weight of her true Luna aura. It did not manifest as physical violence. It hit the throne hall like a sudden, freezing winter gale. The overwhelming scent of frost pine flared, carrying with it a spiritual command. encoded into the very DNA of the Lycan race. Submit to the queen. Ellaraine slammed into that invisible wall of authority. The false Luna's body betrayed her. Her knees buckled violently, cracking against the black marble floor. The poisoned dagger slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering harmlessly away across the stone. She tried to force her head up, tried to spit venom at the maid, but the sheer, crushing pressure of Serafina's aura forced Ellaraine's chin down until she was practically groveling at the hem of Serafina's torn gray dress. The heavy ivory crown, which had never truly belonged to her, slipped from Ellaraine's dark hair. It hit the marble with a hollow ring and rolled away, stopping near the spilled puddle of black blood-bane. Around the dais, the effect of the true Luna's awakening was instantaneous. The rebel guards, already wavering in the face of the Black Lycan's fury, suddenly found their weapons too heavy to lift. Their inner wolves whimpered, utterly terrified of raising a blade against the true mother of the pack. One by one, the traitors dropped their swords, falling to their knees in involuntary submission. The loyalists swiftly moved in, securing the surrendered rebels without shedding another drop of blood. Serafina stood breathing heavily, her hands still instinctively hovering protectively near Nerissa. Despite the dirt on her face and the ragged condition of her maid's uniform, she looked more regal than Ellaraine ever had in 3 years of wearing velvet and jewels. Valerius stared at her. The lethal edge of his battle-ready alpha aura softened entirely. He stepped closer, his broad chest rising and falling as he looked at the glowing silver crescent on her neck. He reached out, his massive, armored hand hesitating before gently cupping her jaw. "My queen," Valerius breathed, the words carrying 4 centuries of waiting. Serafina looked up into his golden eyes. For the first time, she did not see a terrifying king who could order her death, but a protector who had just risked his own empire to shield her and her daughter. She leaned slightly into his touch, her stormy gray eyes finally reflecting a guarded, hard-earned trust. But the moment of peace was violently cut short. A low, unnatural tremor shook the black marble floor beneath their boots. It was not the localized vibration of soldiers fighting. It was a deep, structural groan that seemed to resonate from the very foundations of the Werewolf castle. The chandeliers above swayed, sending chaotic shadows dancing across the walls. Valerius's head snapped toward the dark archway behind the throne. "The royal vault," Valerius snarled, the golden fire returning to his eyes. Cadron had not fled the castle to save his own life. He had gone deeper into the earth, breaking into the forbidden catacombs where the ancient relics of the first Lycan kings were buried. "He is trying to wake the Blood Crown," the elderly royal physician yelled over the rumbling of the floor. "If that dark artifact accepts him, he will have the ancient magic to command the minds of every Lycan in this hall." Valerius did not hesitate. The ancient laws of Werewolf strictly forbade entering the catacombs without the proper ceremonial rites, but a traitor threatening the kingdom's foundation erased all rules. He moved like a shadow, taking the heavy stone steps down into the darkness, 2 at a time. A small detail of elite guards followed immediately, forming a tight, protective diamond formation around Serafina and Nerissa. Valerius had wanted to leave them safely above, but Serafina had refused. The true Luna's instincts tethered her to her mate and her child. Where he went to fight for their kingdom, she would follow. The air in the subterranean vault was freezing. The scent of damp earth and centuries-old dust filled the narrow, torchlit corridor. Suddenly, Valerius stopped. His Lycan senses picked up a faint, unnatural humming in the stone beneath his boots, but he could not see the source. "The floor is angry," Nerissa whispered from the center of the guard formation. The 5-year-old was being carried by one of the massive guards to keep up with the pace, but her pale eyes were wide, staring at the empty corridor ahead. "There are invisible spider webs. Black ones. If you step on them, they bite." Cadron had triggered the vault's ancient defensive wards and corrupted them with dark magic to cover his escape. If Valerius took another step, the invisible magic would trigger a cave-in, burying the king alive. Valerius growled in frustration, his golden eyes scanning the stone. He had raw strength, but he could not fight magic he could not see. He raised a hand to order the guards to pull back and find another route. "Wait." Serafina pushed gently past the elite guards. The men, now deeply recognizing the authority of the true Luna, parted without resistance. She stepped up beside the towering Lycan King. Her frayed gray dress brushed against his armored leg. When she had thrown herself onto the marble floor earlier to save Nerissa, the rough stone had scraped the palm of her hand. A small, thin line of dried blood marked her skin. It was barely a scratch, but for a Werewolf, royal blood was a key to ancient locks. "Seraphina, it is not safe," Valerius warned softly, his instinct to shield her surging forward. "A king protects with his sword," Seraphina replied, her stormy gray eyes meeting his with unwavering resolve. "A queen protects with her truth. Let me clear the path." Valerius looked at her. For 4 centuries, he had fought alone, believing that protecting his kingdom meant bearing every burden himself. But looking at the quiet, unyielding strength of the woman standing beside him, he realized he finally had an equal. He gave a sharp nod and stepped back slightly, offering her the space to lead. Seraphina walked to the edge of the invisible trap. She pressed her scraped palm flat against the freezing stone wall. The moment her Werewolf blood touched the ancient stone, the silver crescent mark on her neck flared brightly. A pulse of pure white light rippled from her hand, traveling rapidly across the floor and walls. The scent of frost pine aggressively chased away the smell of decay. With a sharp, cracking sound like shattering ice, the corrupted dark magic broke. The invisible black webs Nerissa had seen dissolved into harmless gray ash. The path was open. Valerius looked at the glowing ash, then at Seraphina. The profound respect in his golden eyes deepened. "Stay close to me," he murmured, before turning and sprinting down the cleared corridor. They burst into the central chamber of the catacombs. It was a massive, circular cavern dominated by a crude, ancient stone altar. Standing behind the altar was Cadron. He was breathing heavily, his elegant velvet coat torn and covered in dust. But in his hands, he held the ultimate prize of his treason, the blood crown. It was a jagged, ugly circlet of black iron, dripping with a thick, pulsating dark energy that seemed to absorb the torchlight around it. "You always believed that fairness and patience made a strong ruler, Valerius," Cadron sneered, his voice echoing unnaturally in the cavern. The dark artifact was already warping his mind. But true power is not fair. True power is dominance. And now, I have the authority to command every Lycan mind in Verith to tear you apart. Cadron raised the black iron circlet and slammed it down onto his own head. Instantly, a shockwave of suffocating, violent black magic exploded outward from the altar. It moved like a physical wall of force, designed to crush the will of the king and force his inner Lycan to submit to the wearer of the crown. The shockwave of dark magic hit them like a physical avalanche. Cadron screamed in dark, ecstatic triumph as the ancient black magic of the blood crown surged through his veins. The air in the cavern turned freezing and thick. The shadows themselves seemed to stretch and claw toward the Lycan King, attempting to force his mind into submission and drag him to his knees. Valerius braced his massive frame, expecting the psychic agony that legendary texts claimed would follow. It never came. Before the wave of black corruption could touch the king, it hit a wall of blinding silver. Seraphina had not moved from his side. Her hand was firmly grasping his armored forearm. The crescent moon mark on her neck burned with an ethereal, starlight intensity, and the overwhelming scent of frost pine flared, wrapping around Valerius like an unbreakable shield of ice. The dark magic crashed against the true Luna's aura and simply shattered. It hissed and dissolved into harmless mist, unable to pierce the ancient, purifying protection of the Werewolf bloodline. Cadron's triumphant scream abruptly died in his throat. Through the dissipating black smoke, the traitor saw Valerius still standing tall, entirely unaffected. Beside the massive, unyielding king stood the ragged Omega Maid, her gray eyes calm and glowing with quiet, devastating authority. "No," Cadron gasped, stumbling backward against the stone altar. "The crown commands the pack! Kneel! I command you to kneel!" Valerius did not draw his sword. He didn't even quicken his pace. He walked toward the altar with slow, deliberate, terrifying steps. You sought an artifact that feeds on dominance and fear. Valerius's voice resonated through the dark cavern, calm and infinitely cold. You believed power was something you could steal and force upon others, but you understand nothing of what it means to be an alpha. Cadron clawed at the black iron circlet on his head as the dark artifact began to turn on him. The blood crown was sentient enough to sense weakness, and beneath Cadron's political elegance was nothing but the cowardice of a traitor. The black iron began to heat up, burning his temples. A true king does not demand his pack's fear, Valerius said, stopping right in front of the trembling advisor. He looked back over his shoulder at Seraphina, the golden light in his eyes softening for a fraction of a second. He demands their safety. Valerius reached out with one armored hand and grabbed the jagged black iron of the blood crown. Cadron shrieked as the king effortlessly ripped the ancient artifact from his head. Valerius held the corrupted crown suspended in the air. The dark magic flared violently, trying to bite into his hand, but the silver aura of the true Luna surrounding him suffocated the darkness. With a simple, brutal clench of his fist, Valerius crushed the iron. The legendary blood crown cracked. A blinding flash of dark energy imploded inward, and the iron crumbled into coarse black dust, slipping through Valerius's armored fingers and settling onto the cold dirt floor. The threat was over. Cadron collapsed to his knees, completely drained, gasping for air. He stared at the dust on the floor, the realization finally breaking his polished facade. He had spent years planning, manipulating, and poisoning, only to have his grand rebellion dismantled, not by a bloody war, but by the quiet truth of a mother and the steadfast authority of a king. "Take him," Valerius commanded the elite guards. "Bring him to the throne hall." In chains, the guards hauled the broken politician to his feet, binding his wrists with heavy silver irons. Valerius turned back to Seraphina and Nerissa. He walked over to them, the heavy, suffocating tension of the night finally lifting from his broad shoulders. He knelt smoothly before the 5-year-old girl, offering her a faint, rare smile. "The black smoke is gone," Nerissa announced matter-of-factly, her pale eyes clear. "Yes, little one," Valerius rumbled softly, "because you were brave enough to point it out." He stood up, offering his large, calloused hand to Seraphina. She looked at his hand for a long moment, then at the man who had laid his life and his kingdom on the line, to prove she was not just a disposable Omega. Slowly, she placed her small hand in his. As they walked back up the stone steps from the catacombs, the distant sound of fighting above ground had completely ceased. The destruction of the blood crown had broken the morale of any remaining traitors. When Valerius and Seraphina stepped back into the grand throne hall, the first pale light of dawn was breaking through the high stained glass windows. The long night of betrayal was over. Now, the morning of reckoning had arrived. The first light of dawn pierced the high stained glass windows, casting long, colorful shadows across the black marble of the throne hall. The chaos of the night had settled into a heavy, solemn quiet. The rebel guards had been disarmed and bound. The 400 nobles of Verith, who had spent the evening gossiping and celebrating a false union, now stood in tight, terrified clusters, waiting for the wrath of their king. Lycan King Valerius strode through the heavy iron doors, his presence instantly commanding the room. But the eyes of the nobles did not just track the king. They fell upon the woman walking quietly at his side. Seraphina still wore the faded, torn gray uniform of a servant. Her hands were bruised, and dust clung to her skirt. Yet, the blinding silver crescent glowing faintly on her neck, and the crisp, undeniable scent of frost pine surrounding her, demanded absolute reverence. She did not look like a maid. She looked like a queen who had just conquered a war. Nerissa walked beside them, holding her mother's hand, her small face serious and watchful. Valerius stopped at the base of the dais. He gestured for the guards to bring forward the prisoners. Cadron and Elleraine were dragged and thrown onto the cold marble. The elegant advisor looked hollowed out, stripped of his manipulative charm. Elleraine wept silently, staring at the shattered remains of her false ivory crown near the dais. Valerius looked down at them, his golden eyes devoid of pity. You sought to rule this pack through poison, forged decrees, and fear, Valerius said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. You used ancient magic to blind this court and seal the true fate of this kingdom. But a stolen crown is just cold iron. The king did not draw his sword. He did not need to. By the ancient laws of Verith, I strip you of your names, your titles, and your lands, Valerius decreed. You are hereby banished from this kingdom. If you ever cross into our borders again, your lives will be forfeit. Take them away. Elaraine let out a broken sob as the guards hauled them away, dragging them out of the throne hall to face the brutal reality of exile. They were not martyred in blood. They were simply erased from the history of the pack. Valerius turned away from the heavy iron doors. He looked out at the 400 nobles who had, mere hours ago, called Seraphina a filthy omega and demanded her execution. Many of the high lords and ladies trembled, ashamed and fearful of the punishment they believed was coming for their ignorance. But Valerius did not address the crowd. He turned completely to Seraphina. Before the wide, disbelieving eyes of his entire kingdom, the 400-year-old Lycan King stepped back and dropped to one knee. A collective gasp swept through the hall, followed instantly by the rustle of heavy fabrics as noble after noble scrambled to lower their heads, unable to remain standing while their king knelt. Valerius looked up into Seraphina's stormy gray eyes. You stepped in front of a blade to save your child, and in doing so, you saved me, and you saved Verith, Valerius said quietly, though his voice carried clearly to every corner of the silent hall. You did not need a crown to act like a queen. You did it when you had absolutely nothing. He reached out and gently took her bruised hand in his massive, armored one. The magic hid your scent, but it could not hide your courage, Valerius continued, the fierce golden light in his eyes softening into profound devotion. I do not ask you to rule beside me because fate decreed it. I ask you because this kingdom and my heart need a ruler as brave as you. Will you be my Luna, Seraphina? Tears finally welled in Seraphina's eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of a truth finally recognized. 5 years of hiding, of being treated as invisible, washed away in the warmth of his grip. She did not whisper her answer. She spoke it with the clear, unyielding dignity of a white queen. Yes. As she spoke the word, the mate bond fully settled into their souls. The heavy, commanding aura of the Lycan King seamlessly merged with the pure, ancient power of the Werewolf. Valerius stood, gently lifting her hand to his lips. He then turned her toward the crowd. Without needing a single command, the 400 nobles of the Verith Lycan Kingdom dropped to their knees on the cold black marble. The high lords, the proud ladies, the fierce warriors, they all bowed deeply, pressing their foreheads toward the floor in absolute submission and profound regret. The pack had finally recognized their true mother. Hours later, the sun fully illuminated the throne hall. The poison had been scrubbed away, and the broken glass swept up. Valerius sat upon the black iron and silver throne, with Seraphina seated proudly beside him in a simple but elegant royal gown. A nervous servant approached the dais, carrying a silver tray with 2 fresh crystal goblets of morning wine. Before Valerius could reach for his glass, a small figure stepped directly in front of the servant. Nerissa, now wearing a tiny silver circlet in her hair, peered intensely at the dark red liquid. She squinted her pale eyes, inspecting the glass with exaggerated, 5-year-old seriousness. The entire court held its breath, the memory of her earlier scream still fresh in their minds. After a long moment, Nerissa looked up at the towering Lycan King and gave a firm, solemn nod. "It is safe, my king," she announced. Valerius let out a rich, unguarded laugh, a sound the ancient hall had not heard in centuries. He reached out, gently ruffling the child's hair before taking the goblet. He looked at Seraphina, his true Luna, and raised his glass. To truth, to courage, and to the small voices that change the world. Sometimes, the bond they tried to bury is the truth that brings an entire kingdom to its knees. Do you think the false Luna got the punishment she truly deserved by being exiled instead of executed? If you enjoy emotional Alpha King stories about hidden truth, fierce mothers, and queens rising from the shadows. Subscribe and stay with us for the next story.